becomes a kind of diamond-shaped area. This diamond-shaped area bounded anteriorly by the mons pubis. On the lateral sides is the inside of the thigh, or what we call the medial surface of the upper thigh. Sorry. Posterolaterally, we have the gluteal fold. These over here would be the gluteal folds. And posterior most, this is the intergluteal cleft or natal cleft basically. So, in a layman's term, once again I repeat, this is a diamond-shaped area bounded by the upper thighs. Okay. Anteriorly is the pons pubis. Anterolaterally, inside of the thigh, medial surfaces of the thigh. Posterolaterally, we have the gluteal folds, and still posteriorly, we have the intergluteal cleft. Now, those were the boundaries where we just have the flesh or the soft tissues. In anatomical terms, with all the flesh and soft tissue removed, the bony parts of the perineum are osseo-fibrous boundaries, as we call them. They are anteriorly is the pubic symphysis. Anterolaterally is the ischiopubic rami. Still laterally, we have the ischial tuberosities. Posterolaterally, these are the two sacral tuberous ligaments between the sacrum and the tuberosity. Between the sacrum over here and ischial tuberosity. This is the sacrotuberous ligament, and posterior most is the coccyx and the lower part of the sacrum. I repeat once again, the osseo-fibrous boundaries are anteriorly is the symphysis pubis. Anteriorly the symphysis pubis. Anterolaterally is the ischiopubic rami. Ischiopubic rami. Laterally over here you have the ischial tuberosities. Posterolaterally is the sacrotuberous ligament. Yeah. And still posteriorly, posterior most is the coccyx and the lower part of the sacrum. They make up the osseo-fibrous boundaries of the perineum. अच्छा जी. Still continuing with the perineum. The perineum, this diamond-shaped area, as I told you, this is divided into two halves by a transverse line. This transverse line is drawn in between the two ischial tuberosities, from one ischial tuberosity to the other. This is a transverse line that divides this diamond-shaped perineum into two triangles. The posterior one is the anal triangle. The anterior is the urogenital triangle. This is the urogenital triangle. This urogenital triangle is closed by the perineal membrane. So you have the perineal membrane attached to this part. So in life, it is closed by the perineal membrane. This is what the perineal membrane, this whitish structure is the perineal membrane. Half of this is cut actually. It extends from one ischiopubic ramus to the other ischiopubic ramus. This is half of this is cut. Okay, this white is the perineal membrane. Now, let's do the perineal membrane. The perineal membrane is also called the inferior fascia of the urogenital diaphragm. Inferior fascia of the urogenital diaphragm. This is the perineal membrane. This is how it stretches between the two pubic arches. ये pubic arch है. The pubic arch is stretching from one pubic arch to the other. Now, when we did the pelvis long time ago now, I told you that these are the two levator ani. Between the two levator ani is this gap. This gap is called urogenital hiatus. Urogenital hiatus. This is the gap which is called urogenital hiatus. This perineal membrane closes this urogenital hiatus. Only two openings are left. Anteriorly is the urethra in the males. In the males, there is just one opening. So the perineal membrane in the males is perforated by one opening, which is which is the urethra. Males may. Females may, this membrane, the perineal membrane, is perforated by two openings. Anteriorly urethra, posteriorly vagina. So females may, there are two openings that perforate the perineal membrane. This is the entire perineal membrane that you see. And please note one thing. This that you see is the undersurface or the inferior surface of the perineal membrane. Attached to the inferior surface of the perineal membrane are the external genitalia. These are the external genitalia attached to the inferior surface of the perineal membrane. यहाँ पे भी देख लीजिए, the bulb of the, these are the two ischiocavernosus muscles. This is the bulbospongiosus muscle. They are all attached to the undersurface of the perineal membrane. And that is the main purpose that this membrane is serving, namely, it gives attachment to the external genitalia. Now, let's come to this ever important structure, which is the perineal body. Perineal body is also called the central tendon of the perineum. This is the central tendon of the perineum, also called the perineal body. Now, this perineal body is present at a point which is midway between the two ischial tuberosities. One ischial tuberosity, the other ischial tuberosity. You join the two ischial tuberosities, and at the midpoint of the ischial tuberosities, this is at the midpoint on the line drawn from one ischial tuberosity to the other ischial tuberosity. You have this central point, which is called the central point of the perineum. That is where you have the perineal body. The perineal body is immediately deep to the skin. Okay? It is immediately deep to the skin. It is lying between these two structures. This is the perineal body. Anterior to the perineal body is the vagina. Okay? Basically, anterior to the, in the females, anterior to the perineal body is the vestibule. Vestibule is the common opening for the vagina and the urethra. So this entire area is the vestibule, which is simply a common opening for the urethra and the vagina in the females. So anterior to the, this is the perineal body. Anterior to the perineal body is the vestibule, and posterior to the perineal body is the anal canal. Okay? And please note one more thing. In this section, this is a female pelvis. This structure is the perineal body over here. Okay? Superior to the perineal body, you have this fascia between the rectum and the vagina, the recto-vaginal septum, or the recto-vaginal connective tissue is attached to the superior surface of the perineal body. Okay. ये देख लीजिए, ठीक है? Recto-vaginal connective tissue है या recto-vaginal septum? Now, what exactly is the perineal body made up of? Fibromuscular structure है, so connective tissue will be present. Besides, it has few muscles that are inserted into the perineal body. We have this muscle. This is the bulbospongiosis muscle. And sorry. Then you have this muscle, ischiocavernosus muscle. ये तो खैर इसमें नहीं attached होता, the bulbospongiosis is attached to it. Yeah. Then you have the superficial and the deep transverse perineae. ये superficial transverse perineae is seen over here. Then you also have the external anal sphincter. This is also getting attached to the perineal body. Then what you don't see over here is the external urethral sphincter. There are several other smooth muscle fibers getting inserted into the perineal body as well. A few smooth muscle fibers from the rectum are inserted over here, and some fibers from the anal canal also get inserted over here, besides the external anal sphincter. Now, this is very important because this perineal body is very important because during normal delivery, during normal labor, normal delivery of a baby, vagina has to be massively dilated, and a tear, this area, this perineal body is torn, फट जाती है, and it has to be stitched. So what the gynecologists, obstetricians do, they incise or they cut the perineal body with a knife, either in the midline or laterally. इसको episiotomy कहते हैं. Cutting of perineal body is called episiotomy. ठीक है? ये एक normal procedure है. After the delivery, this cut is then stitched up. और वो खुद ही heal कर जाता है, and nothing goes wrong. However, if they do not make this incision and this perineal body is torn, फट जाती है, you still have to stitch it, but then stitching becomes very difficult. Okay, because this type of a wound also is difficult to heal. A clean incised wound is very easy to heal. Now, one by one, let's do the perineal fascia. Now, remember one thing, that the fascia has superficial and deep layers, subcutaneous tissue. Subcutaneous tissue जो है, that has a fatty layer and a membranous layer that are continuous with the fatty and membranous layer of the anterior abdominal wall. Now, fatty layer की बात कर लेते हैं in the females. Females or males में इसकी distribution of the fatty layer is different. Females में the fatty layer from the perineum is then goes onto the front of the symphysis pubis. This area is called the mons pubis. This yellow is fatty layer, and then it is continuous with the fatty layer of the anterior abdominal wall. I'll repeat once again. From the perineum, please trace this yellow. This is the fatty layer. Goes to the front of the pubic symphysis, which is the mons pubis, and then is continuous with the fatty layer of the anterior abdominal wall. Superiorly, it becomes continuous with the fatty layer of the anterior abdominal wall. Males may it's a little different because males may there is a scrotum. A scrotum may, if you remember, you have the dartus muscle, and dartus muscle is nothing but smooth muscle fibers getting inserted into the overlying skin. Okay? अच्छा जी फैटी लेयर्स मेल में ट्रेस कर लेते हैं मेल्स में ये देख लीजिए दिस येलो sawtooth वाली लेयर जो है दिस इज द फैटी लेयर सो दिस फैटी लेयर इज रिप्लेस्ड बाय डार्टस मसल ठीक है ये जो ब्राउन ब्राउन सी लाइन है ये सारी डार्टस मसल है which lines the scrotum and then superiorly it becomes continuous with the fatty layer of the anterior abdominal wall उसी तरह से but the difference is that over here it is lining the scrotum and into it the dartus muscle is inserted so we call it the dartus muscle layer. However, in both the genders this perineal fascia posteriorly over here ये ठीक है this is the site where you would have the ischial fossa. Okay. So posteriorly it becomes continuous with the fat of the ischial fossa. Males में देख लीजिए ये yellow जो है this is the layer of the dartus muscle. हाँ जी बेटा मैं क्लास ले रही हूँ बच्चे I am taking a class. I'll talk to you after the class. ओके जी पेरिनियल फैशिया पे आ जाते हैं मेम्ब्रेनस लेयर अभी तक डू वी हैव एनी क्वेश्चंस I suppose there are no questions. अच्छा जी So now let's do the deeper layer, which is the membranous layer of perineal fascia. Membranous layer के लिए please trace this blue structure, this blue line. ठीक है? This has to be traced. Females के लिए भी और males के लिए भी. Now The membranous layer posteriorly fuses with this, which is the perineal body and the perineal membrane. ठीक है? So the membranous layer posteriorly in both the genders. यहाँ भी देख लीजिए, यहाँ भी देख लीजिए. It fuses with the perineal body. Laterally on both sides, it continues with the fascia lata. अब anteriorly क्या है? Males में dartus fascia बन जाता है. Fascia deep to the dartus muscle, and then it continues with the fascia on the anterior abdominal wall, deep to the fatty layer, which continues with the membranous layer of the anterior abdominal wall. ठीक है, मैं फिर repeat कर देती हूँ. In both the genders, this membranous layer posteriorly fuses with the perineal body and perineal membrane. ये perineal membrane fuses with the perineal membrane and the perineal body, and then males में different है. Males में it is deep to the dartus muscle and it continues as the dartus fascia around the scrotum, and then it is reflected and onto the anterior abdominal wall, where it becomes continuous with the membranous layer of the anterior abdominal wall. ठीक है? Females में क्या होता है? Females में it is continuous posteriorly with the central tendon of the perineum, also called the perineal body, and the perineal membrane. This is the perineal membrane, and then it continues onto the anterior abdominal wall, deep to the fatty layer. On the anterior abdominal wall, it is continuous with the membranous layer of the anterior abdominal wall. Now, there's one more type of fascia, which is the deep perineal fascia. This deep perineal fascia invests these muscles: bulbospongiosis, ischiocavernosus, and over here you would have the superficial transverse perineal. So, tracing from one side, and laterally, obviously, you have the ischiopubic rami. These are the ischiopubic rami. In other words, this deep perineal fascia lines the ischiocavernosus, it lines the superficial transverse perineal, it lines the bulbospongiosus, once again the superficial transverse perineal, and then ischiocavernosus, and then still laterally it is attached to the ischiopubic rami. Anteriorly, it is continuous with the suspensory ligament of the penis or the clitoris, depending on the fascia, and then above it is continuous with the fascia covering the sternal oblique. This is the fascia covering the sternal oblique. अच्छा जी, superficial perineal pouch. अब ये pouches, they are very important from your examination point of view. बहुत question आते हैं. The superficial perineal pouch is the area between the perineal fascia and the undersurface of the perineal membrane. ये perineal membrane है, and this is the perineal fascia. So the area between the undersurface of the perineal membrane and the perineal fascia, that is the area of the superficial perineal pouch. It is bounded laterally by the ischiopubic rami. ठीक है? क्योंकि पेरिनियल मेम्ब्रेन हमने अभी डिस्कस किया था, इसकी ट्यूबुलोसिटी is big, So the space between the perineal membrane, ischiopubic rami, and the the perineal fascia. This space is the superficial perineal pouch. Now, इनके contents in the males and females are different. Males की पहले बात कर लेते हैं. Males में this area is the superficial perineal pouch. It took in the superficial perineal pouch we have the external genitalia mainly. Okay, so males में it's going to be the bulb, the root and the bulb of the penis. We have this bulbospongiosus muscle. Yeah, this is the proximal part of the penis, and this is the spongy urethra. Okay, so covering it, this muscle is the bulbospongiosus. We have this muscle at this side, which is the ischiocavernosus. Okay, okay. Then you have the superficial transverse perineum over here, attached to the undersurface. ये देख लीजिए, the superficial transverse perineum. Over here would be the bulbospongiosus, ischiocavernosus, superficial transverse perineum, and then of course you have deep perineal branches of over here. We have deep perineal branches of internal pudendal artery and pudendal nerve. Okay? So once again, like at the cost of repeating myself, you have the external genitalia, root and bulb of the penis, you have the bulbospongiosus muscle, you have the ischiocavernosus muscle, you have the proximal part of the urethra over here, spongy urethra. Then you have superficial transverse perineum. This is the superficial transverse perineum attached to the inferior surface or the anterior surface of the perineal membrane, and then you have the blood vessels, branches of the internal iliac artery and the internal pudendal artery and the pudendal nerves and blood vessels. अच्छा जी, फीमेल्स में क्या होता है? बेसिक स्ट्रक्चर वही है, ठीक है, थोड़ा सा डिफरेंस है. Number one, वही के this is the perineal membrane attached to the anterior surface of the perineal membrane or the external genitalia. In this case, it's going to be the clitoris and the bulb of the vestibule. ठीक है. Besides, you have these muscles, वही वाले bulbospongiosus, ischiocavernosus, and please note these P-shaped structures, yellow in color. They are the creative vestibular glands. Males, when there were no glands. Superficial perineal pouch in the males contains no glands. However, in the female, lying deep to this structure, which is the bulb of the clitoris, partly covered by the bulb of the clitoris on the posterior aspect. Posterior end of the bulb of the clitoris partly covers this gland, which is the greater vestibular gland, which is a mucus secreting gland. Okay? Then you have this muscle, which is the superficial transverse perineum. And of course, don't forget, you have nerves and blood vessel, internal pudendal artery and pudendal nerve branches. Let's compare the contents of the superficial perineal pouch in both the genders. देख लीजिए, males में वही है, external genitalia, root and bulb of the penis. Females में it is the clitoris. ये देख लीजिए, यहाँ पे ये females में this is the clitoris. Then you have muscles, वही bulbospongiosus, Bulbospongiosis, यहाँ पे ये है bulbospongiosis. Ischiocavernosus, this is the ischiocavernosus. Females में ये ischiocavernosus है. Females में अब difference है, greater vestibular glands आते हैं. Males में there are no glands. Females में भी urethra है. Males में proximal part of the spongy urethra है. Superficial transverse perineae in males and in females. Okay? And then of course you have nerves and blood vessels that we've already mentioned. So the difference is सेरेन जेनिटेलिया दोनों में है और the only difference is this greater vestibular glands. Obviously external genitalia, the names of external genitalia would be different on two sides. अच्छा जी. Now let's come to the deep perineal pouch. Now the deep perineal pouch is bounded by this. This is the fascia, superior fascia of the urogenital diaphragm. It was superiorly, and this fascia is the inferior fascia of the pelvis. Pelvic floor का ये inferior fascia. So superiorly, it is bounded by the inferior fascia of the pelvic floor. ये कोई हार्ड एंड फास्ट बाउंड्री नहीं है, इनडिस्टिंक्ट सा fascia होता है, ठीक है. But however, it is a fascia that lines the undersurface of the pelvic diaphragm. This part, this is the inferior fascia of the urogenital diaphragm. This inferior fascia is the perineal membrane. So superiorly, it is the inferior fascia of the pelvic diaphragm, and inferiorly, it is the perineal membrane. Between these two membranes, this area is the deep perineal pouch. Laterally, ये obturator internus है, ठीक है, ये pelvic levator ani है. So laterally, it is bounded by the fascia covering the obturator internus. ये green में जो है, this is the fascia covering the obturator internus. So laterally, it is bounded by fascia covering the obturator internus. Okay? And of course, in both the genders, it includes the anterior recesses of ischioradial fossa, who are already actual. Deep perineal pouch of males or females, there is a bit of a difference. Okay? Males may, the deep perineal pouch contains the urethra, this part of the urethra, the intermediate part of the urethra, also called the membranous part of the urethra. This is the narrowest part of the urethra in the males. So in the males, the narrowest part of the urethra is the membranous urethra or the intermediate urethra, which is lying in the deep perineal pouch. Okay? So ये urethra है. And then you have, in the males, you have deep transverse perineae. The deep transverse perineae muscles. This muscle is lying on the upper surface of the perineal membrane. Where on the perineal membrane? ये जो posterior border होता है ना perineal membrane का, इस posterior border, just on the upper surface of the posterior border, you have this muscle which is called deep transverse perineae, and lying deep to the deep transverse perineae muscle, you have this structure, the bulbourethral glands. ठीक है, ये यहाँ पे ये देख लीजिए bulbourethral glands lying in the deep transverse perineae. इनकी जो ducts है ना bulbourethral glands की, they pass through the perineal membrane and enter into the spongy urethra. We've already talked about this earlier on when we did the internal genital organs in the male. And of course, don't forget you have neurovascular structures that supply the penis. डीप पेरिनियल पाउच की बात कर लो. तीन. फीमेल्स में डीप पेरिनियल पाउच की बात करते हैं. The contents include the urethra, the vagina over here, okay? And then don't forget one thing कि यहाँ पे कोई well defined deep transverse perineal muscle नहीं है. There is a bundle of muscles which is uh, a bunch of smooth muscles. ठीक है, that inserts into the perineal body. ये perineal body over here. ठीक है. Yes, there is a bunch of muscles, but traditionally, classically, it is not called uh, deep transverse perineum. Actually, so this is the vagina. This is the deep perineal pouch. Okay, so you see the vagina over here. Of course, you cannot see in the cut section. You cannot see the urethra. So अब इनको compare कर लें. Deep perineal pouch in both the genders. Males may intermediate part of the urethra. Females may you have the proximal part of the urethra. Females may you also have the vagina. Males may you have the deep transverse perineum lying on the superior aspect, the posterior margin, perineal membrane. Females may you have a bunch of muscles, smooth muscles, but classically इसको classically they are not called the deep transverse perineum. And then males may you have the bulbourethral glands. ठीक है जी. अच्छा. And then of course you have the neurovascular structures. Okay. The urogenital diaphragm. The urogenital diaphragm is bounded by superiorly by the superior by the fascia covering the undersurface of the pelvic diaphragm. Inferiorly, it is bounded by the perineal membrane. And in between these two, we have a mass of muscles. This mass of muscles contains the deep transverse perineum and the external urethral sphincter. These two muscles make up the urogenital diaphragm. Males may this urogenital diaphragm also contains the bulbourethral glands. Okay, so I repeat once again, urogenital diaphragm is composed of a mass of muscles, which is this is the mass of muscles, which is present in between the inferior fascia of the pelvic diaphragm and the perineal membrane. Between these two, we have a mass of muscles. The muscles are the transverse perineum and the external urethral sphincters. Males may you also have the bulbourethral glands. Now, थोड़ा सा अब यहाँ पे concept is a little different. कि males में तो you have the deep transverse perineum. ठीक है जी. लेकिन females में you do not have a classical deep transverse perineum. That deep transverse perineum is replaced by a smooth mass of smooth muscle, which is inserted into the perineal body. ठीक है. External urethral sphincters दोनों में होगा. Now, males way external urethral sphincters surround, encircles the membranous urethra and goes as far as the neck of the urinary bladder. Females may, it encircles the urethra, all right, and this is the external urethral sphincter. It merges with the external urethral sphincter. In both the genders, ये देख लीजिए ये जो muscle है external urethral sphincter. This is more or less vertically placed. यहाँ पे भी देख लीजिए ये external urethral sphincter is more or less vertically placed. पहले जो concept था, they thought that it was lying horizontally. लेकिन अब ये है कि the transverse perineum is lying horizontally, but the external urethral sphincter is more vertically placed. And then, of course, don't forget these fibers of the smooth muscle that make up the compressor urethra, that compress the urethra. And females may also, you have a ureterovaginal sphincter. This is the vagina. This is the urethra. Females may, you also have this ureterovaginal sphincter, and this is the compressor urethra. Okay, now do we have any questions? Any questions, beta, as far as the perineum is concerned? No questions? Okay, fine. If you have no questions, so I'll give you a quick recap of pelvis as well. The pelvic girdle is formed between the hip bones, the sacrum. Hip bones की जो medial surfaces, the medial surfaces of the hip bone make up the lateral wall of the pelvis, and posteriorly we have the sacrum. Anteriorly we have this joint between the two hip bones, which makes the pubic surfaces. This is the pubic arch, pubic inlet की पहले. It is made up of ischiopubic rami and the subpubic angle. This is the brim of the pelvis. Pelvic inlet की पहले बात कर लेते हैं. Superiorly, you have the pubic surfaces. Posteriorly, there is the sacral promontory. This is the sacral promontory. Ala of the sacrum. Ala of the sacrum. And laterally, this is the pectineal line, pectin pubis, and then this is pectineal line, and then the arcuate lines. So in one continuous goal, you have the pubic surfaces, pectin pubis, pectineal line, the arcuate line, ala of the sacrum, and then comes the sacral promontory. All this makes up the pelvic inlet. And the pelvic outlet is formed by the pubic symphysis, and posteriorly is the coccyx. Anterolaterally is the ischiopubic ramus over here, and posterolaterally you have the sacropubis ligament. So in one go, if I talk about the pelvic outlet, it is the inferior border of the pubic symphysis, ischiopubic ramus, sacrotuberous ligament, and then the coccyx. This is the pelvic outlet. We divide the pelvis into a greater pelvis and a lesser pelvis. The greater pelvis is above the pelvic inlet. This area above the pelvic inlet is the greater pelvis. It is bounded by the ala of the ilium, iliac bones. Okay, this is the ala of the ilium. It is completed posteriorly by the vertebral column and the muscles that join the vertebral column to the ilium, and anteriorly the greater pelvis is completed by the anterior abdominal wall. The lesser pelvis is between the pelvic inlet and the pelvic outlet, and it is formed by the pelvic surface of the hip bones. ठीक है? Actually, so this is the greater pelvis between the two ala, between the two iliac fossae. This is the pelvic inlet. This is the pelvic outlet. Between the pelvic inlet and the pelvic outlet, you have the pelvic cavity. The pelvis inferiorly is closed by the pelvic floor, made up of levator ani. It is concave on the upper side, and it is convex inferiorly. This convex inferior surface forms the upper boundary of the perineum. So below the levator ani, the fascia covering the levator, inferior surface of the levator ani, we have the perineum. How do you hold the pelvis? Orientation. You hold the pelvis in such a way that the anterior sphenic spine and pubic tubercle, they are in one vertical line. So this is how you place the pelvis. Anterior sphenic spine and pubic tubercle in one line. Okay, fine. It's 11 o'clock and let's finish off with today's lecture. Actually, let's compare the male and the female pelvis. But before we go any further, do we have any questions regarding the pelvis? I guess no. In that case, let's do the differences between male and female pelvis. A female pelvis is generally lighter compared to uh, heavy, thick pelvis in the male pelvis. The greater pelvis is deep. कि ये आपको females में relatively shallow मिलेगी. The lesser pelvis is narrow. ये देख लीजिए. इसकी width देख लीजिए compared to the female pelvis. Pelvic inlet in the males is sort of heart-shaped.
तो पता चल जाएगा कि वहां पे भी कितना काम हो रहा है. ठीक है. आज के टेस्ट में कोई प्रॉब्लम तो नहीं आई? सेकेंड ईयर के जो रिप्रो का टेस्ट था